Good afternoon, everybody. Shabbat Shalom, Sohorayim Tovim, which is how you say good afternoon. I wanted to welcome you all back. Thank you for coming back to join me for Shabbat Chaverim this beautiful Shabbat afternoon. And I hope you had a nice morning, a nice lunch. And I just want to bring everybody kind of up to speed because I know that some of you watch the Hi There with Rabbi Leah program, and others of you do not. But this past Tuesday and Thursday, I began to take a look at the history of American Jewish and American Black relations, which has had a very interesting history for as many years as the United States has been around. And so, what I'm going to do this afternoon is review a little bit of some of the material that I already taught, and then go back and I'll go back and do that, and then I'm going to move ahead to more recent times until we get through the history. And then, if we have some time, what I'd like to do is take a look at some of the statements that have come out from the major Jewish movements, the Reform movement, the Conservative movement, the Reconstructionist movement, the Religious Action Center in Washington, D.C., which is the social justice arm of the Reform movement, and give you a sense of what kinds of formal statements are coming out of these various arms of Judaism regarding the murder of George Floyd and race relations, criminal justice, and so on. So that's where we're headed today. The history of African American and Jewish relations goes back to the founding of the United States of America, and even before, way before, before the colonial period, and we really picked up our discussion more in the early 20th century, because that's when things began to move in kind of this roller coaster pattern where there would be good relationships and then there would be a spate of bad time, and then the civil rights movement, which many called the golden era of Black and Jewish relationships, because there was enormous support among the Jewish community for the civil rights movement. In fact, Jews who were involved in the civil rights movement, and so on. I want to go back and mention just a few of those who were key in this time. We look at the American Jewish Committee and the American Jewish Congress and the Anti-Defamation League. These three organizations were integrally involved in the campaign against racial prejudice. And Jews made substantial financial contributions to many civil rights organizations, including the NAACP and the Urban League and the Congress of Racial Equality, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, all of these groups. And in fact, at one point in time in the early to mid 60s, about 50% of the civil rights attorneys in the South during the 60s were Jews. So we could see that there was a relationship that went beyond just lip service, that went really to feet on the ground and walking the walk, not just talking the talk. So 50% of those, actually over 50% of those who went to Mississippi in 1964 to challenge the Jim Crow laws were white Americans, and among them many, many Jews. And we've all seen the famous photographs from the March on Washington with rabbis linked arm in arm with Martin Luther King and other major civil rights leaders walking in solidarity for racial justice, for the banishing of discrimination policies, and so on. So at the same time, though, there was an undercurrent from the African American community that Jews were allegedly trying to destroy the black population of America. And one of the issues that has come up in these recent um, protests is that the African American population and people of color in the United States do not want others leading these protests. They are looking for allies, not looking for white leaders. And so, possibly part of the tension that began to develop during the civil rights era was that African Americans felt, and this is particularly true for Jews who were involved in the civil rights movement, that they were trying to take over. They were trying to make the black story their story. Now, there are, needless to say, enormous numbers of similarities. Um, we just observed Pesach. It seems like 1,000 years ago, but it was only a couple months ago. And it was thousands of years ago as well. But we find that our history as Jews who were enslaved for 400 years, Jews who have been the subject of ridicule and anti-Semitism and an attempted and almost successful Holocaust, which wiped out millions and millions of Jews in gas chambers. So we see so many of these similarities and things that would bring us together with the black community and with other nationalities and races who have had to succumb to some of these horrific acts perpetrated by other people. However, a movement is only successful when the leadership of that movement comes from within that movement. And therefore, in the 60s, primarily leading up to and following the death of Martin Luther King, there was this feeling among the African American community that Jews really didn't get it. They didn't get it because they were, for the most part, white. And particularly within the time period of 10 to 20 years following the Second World War, many of the GIs who came back, those who were Jewish, had gone to college on the GI Bill, were beginning to get married, have families, and leaving the urban areas. We know that term white flight, which is so distasteful, but is really evident of what happened. Many Jews were becoming more middle class and upper middle class, left the urban area, moved to the suburbs, and began to have their lives there. And the suburban areas were predominantly white, if not all white, and many areas in which a middle class or upper middle class African American family wanted to move, wanted to live, was not available to them. And so we began to see a fracture in in the relationships between blacks and Jews. And yet there were still pockets, particularly for Southern Jews, who would continue to speak out on civil rights issues and participate in marches in the South. And perhaps because they live in a more diverse population in the South than Jews in the North and the West, where much of the Jewish support for the civil rights movement had initially come. So we talked about the Black Power movement, and it was really in the late 60s, around 1966, when this nice collaboration between Jews and blacks started to unravel. Again, because Jews were transitioning more to an upper middle class status. They were distancing themselves from blacks, and at the same time, many black leaders, particularly in this Black Power movement, were becoming much more outspoken in their demands for greater equality, and often criticizing Jews with other white targets, because after all, 99%, 99 and 9/10% of Jews were white. That has changed. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, because Jews of color have become much more prominent in our religion. And as a result, this movement back towards racial equality has taken on a whole new meaning within Judaism. So we spoke briefly about the Black Israelites, who also call themselves Black Hebrews, Hebrew Israelites. There are a number of different monikers. And this is a group of mostly Black American ancestry, individuals of American ancestry, situated in the Americas, both North America and South America, that claim to be descendants of the ancient Israelites. And to varying degrees, some of them adhere to Jewish practices, some of them adhere to Christian practices, some of them have kind of conflated their practice, a little bit of each, but they have really diverged from mainstream Judaism, and frequently have extreme hostility towards Jews. And they consider themselves, and not Jews, to be the only authentic descendants of the ancient Israelites. And yet they are not considered Jewish among the mainstream Jewish movements. So that has created quite a bit of controversy as well. Okay. We talked about the civil rights movement as being what they called the golden age, where during the civil rights movement there were many Jews, many prominent Jews who were involved, great cooperation between African Americans and Jewish Americans, and that Jewish agencies often engaged with their African American counterparts in a more sustained and fundamental way. Tootsie is my audience. And the Reform Jews participated much more frequently than did Orthodox Jews. Many Reform Jews were guided by the values of the prophetic voice, to fight against the marginalization of other people, and so this really fit with the values and the social justice arm of the Reform movement. And in fact, the Pittsburgh Platform, which was one of the earlier platforms that came out of the Reform movement, urged Jews to, quote, participate in the great task of modern times to solve, on the basis of justice and righteousness, the problems presented by the contrasts and evils of the present organization of society. And they were specifically speaking to the situation with Black Americans. And religious leaders and rabbis, along with Baptist ministers and Black churches, often played pivotal roles in the civil rights movement. We all know about Abraham Joshua Heschel, of course, who marched with Martin Luther King in the Selma to Montgomery marches. 16 Jewish leaders were arrested heeding that call from Martin Luther King in St. Augustine, Florida. That was in June of 1964. It was a mass arrest of rabbis. It was the largest mass arrest of rabbis in American history. which took place at the Monson Motor Lodge. Now, I believe there have been greater mass arrests of rabbis since that time. And some of those, I believe, have taken place more recently in the during the, I'm going to use the word incarceration of children in detention centers who came from south of the border, and as far as we know, are still sitting locked behind cages. So I do have several colleagues who were arrested during some of those protests on the borders. There was a riot in Crown Heights in Brooklyn during this time. Northern and Western Jews were really the ones who fought most for desegregation in their communities and their schools, even at the risk of diluting their close-knit Jewish communities, because, not all Jewish communities were of one mind. Just like not all Jewish communities today are of one mind. In congregational life, we find many Jews who are extremely liberal in their politics, and we have other Jews who are extremely conservative in their politics, and we have to tread carefully in order to find common ground so that we can serve all of our constituents, regardless of their political beliefs. So the summer of 1964, which was designated as the Freedom Summer, which many of you will remember, many Jews from the North and the West traveled to the South to participate in a very concentrated voter registration effort. And I think this summer you are going to see a replay of the Freedom Summer that we saw in 1964, because what's going on right now with the racial tensions brought about by the murder of several innocent African American individuals at the hands of police and vigilantes who go after them with a truck and rifles, I think we're going to see an enormous push towards voter registration for the fall among non-white populations. So we know that in 1964 there was a huge move for voter registration, and many Jews from the North and the West went to the South to assist with this effort. Two of those people, Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner, along with a black activist, James Chaney, were murdered by the Ku Klux Klan in Mississippi as a result of their participation. And their deaths were considered martyrdom by some. And that temporarily strengthened these black-Jewish relations. Unfortunately, there were many in the African American community who felt that the murder of the two Jewish young men overshadowed the murder of the black activist James Chaney, and as a result they felt that it got more press and more notice, and so that created some tensions as well. Martin Luther King said in 1965, how could there be anti-Semitism among Negroes when our Jewish friends have demonstrated their commitment to the principle of tolerance and brotherhood, not only in the form of sizable contributions, but in many other tangible ways, and often at great personal sacrifice? Can we ever express our appreciation to the rabbis who chose to give moral witness with us in St. Augustine during our recent protest against segregation in that unhappy city? Need I remind anyone of the awful beating suffered by Rabbi Arthur Lelyveld of Cleveland? Some of you knew Rabbi Lelyveld, and I've talked to you about that. When he joined the civil rights workers there in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, And who can forget the sacrifice of two Jewish lives, Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner, in the swamps of Mississippi? It would be impossible to record the contribution that the Jewish people have made toward the Negro's struggle for freedom. It has been so great. And we no longer use the term that Martin Luther King used, but of course, Negro was the terminology during the 60s and the Civil Rights Movement. So that kind of brings us to a more current, although current is it's an interesting phrase to use because Jewish history and Black history are very old, both of them, and so by current history, I'm talking about post World War II, or almost post World War II. And I want to go back to this because this is also part of the history that led to some of the fracture in the Black-Jewish relationships. And that was the labor movement, because the labor movement was very strongly led by Jews. The Jewish labor committees, the International Ladies Garment Workers, very highly run by Jewish individuals, and there were African American groups that felt that there was anti-Black racial discrimination and that they were not being seen as fairly represented in these unions, and described the Jewish Labor Committee as anti-Black. And so we began to see a fracture here among the labor unions as well in terms of Black-Jewish relations. And the New York City teachers' strike in 1968 also signaled a decline in Jewish and Black relations, because the Jewish president of the United Federation of Teachers, Albert Shanker, evidently made some statements that were seen by many as accusing Black teachers of anti-Semitism. So this is going to bring us now to an even more current history. There has been, since the Six-Day War, a criticism among some African American communities of Israel following the Six-Day War, when Israel took over the West Bank and Gaza. And some American Blacks supported the Palestinians and criticized Israel's actions. For example, they publicly supported Yasser Arafat, called for the destruction of the Jewish state. Some famous people such as Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X also criticized the Zionist movement. And immediately after the Six-Day War, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, their newsletter, wrote an article. This is a Black student student organization, wrote an article which criticized Israel and asserted that the Six-Day War was an effort to regain Palestinian land. And it also asserted that during the 1948 war, the Zionists conquered the Arab homes and land through terror, force, and massacres. So this sense of anti-Zionism has been one thread through the African American community that has unfortunately worked against the opportunity for more peaceful American Jewish and American Black relations. Concerns of Blacks were expressed. In 1993, Cornel West wrote that Jews will not comprehend what the symbolic predicament and literal plight of the Palestinians in Israel means to Blacks. Blacks often perceive the Jewish defense of the state of Israel as a second instance of naked group interest and again an abandonment of substantive moral deliberation. So, while others were attempting to continue to support these joined efforts, including Martin Luther King, because he criticized this position. He spoke at the 68th Annual Rabbinical Assembly for Conservative Judaism, and he said, on the Middle East crisis, we have had various responses. The responses of the so-called young militants does not represent the position of the vast majority of Negroes. There are some who are color consumed and see a kind of mystique in being colored, and anything non-colored is condemned. We do not follow that course in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and certainly most of the organizations in the civil rights movement do not follow that course. So this criticism of Zionism came out of a more militant Black mindset that began to see Jewish Americans as an enemy and not an ally, which was an unfortunate position. The issue of of affirmative action also came to be a point of discussion and a point of disagreement between Black Americans and Jewish Americans. Many Blacks have supported government and business affirmative action, while many Jews have not, preferring a merit-based system. And historians believe that this difference in this position on affirmative action also contributed to the decline of the Black-Jewish alliance in the 1970s. Blacks began seeking ways to build on the civil rights legislation of the 60s, and Blacks continued to face widespread discrimination, struggled to make progress in society, began to become increasingly militant. So I think that, or some of the authors, in particular, I read one author, Greenberg, I do not recall his first name, who felt that some of this increased resentment among Jews was developed at this time when Black communities were fighting in a more militant way for civil rights, for affirmative action, and no matter where you stand on that topic of affirmative action, this is what happened. White Jews continued to make their mark, continued to become better educated, continued to move into the suburbs, continued to move into middle class and upper middle class socioeconomic positions, while the Black community continued to fight for civil rights and were met with constant barriers. So there was a survey done in the late 70s of affirmative action lawsuits found that Jewish organizations have generally opposed these affirmative action programs. And there was a landmark case in 1978, an affirmative action case, Regents of the University of California versus Bakke, where Black and Jewish organizations took opposing sides. It was a case of a white student who sued for admission, claiming that he was unfairly excluded from entry into the University of California by affirmative action programs. And there were Black and Jewish organizations that took opposite sides on this issue of affirmative action at that time. I'm going to talk a bit now about anti-Semitism among African Americans, but don't worry, lest you think I'm not going to talk about racism among American Jews, white American Jews. We're getting there. So, Some leaders of the Black community have publicly made anti-Semitic comments, expressing anti-Semitic sentiments and opinions that are held by a wider and wider circle of Blacks, accusing Jews of over-aggressiveness in business relationships, loyalty to Israel rather than loyalty to the United States, alleged participation in the slave trade, economic oppression, and so on. And some of these are anti-Semitic memes and anti-Semitic tropes that we're familiar with, that we've heard for generations and generations. Jews run the media, Jews run the banks, Jews run the stock exchange, Jews, run the corporations and the real estate and everything else, and have used anti-Semitism as a wedge. And so there are some analysts who say that a lot of this, they attribute this Black anti-Semitism to resentment or envy directed at another underdog who has made it in American society. And although I understand that position, I also think that it's an oversimplification. I don't think that resentment is based solely on envy. Yes, if I am a member of an oppressed group, but not the same way that an African American is. And I think that were I to see another underdog in society who was beginning to make their way as a minority, what's one of the most obvious differences is the color of skin. And although I can walk through the world as a white Jewish woman, the fact that I am white and the fact that I'm a woman are fairly obvious. The fact that I am Jewish is not at all obvious, unless I'm wearing a kippah, unless I am in a religious setting where I have a talit on, unless I have a larger Jewish star than the little tiny one that I wear all the time. And it's little and tiny, not because I'm ashamed or embarrassed of my Judaism, but simply because I loved it. But I think that we have to understand that as a person of color, you never walk through the world as anything other than a person of color. That is the first thing that is seen. So we don't really have an option to change our skin color. And so there was this building resentment. And we saw it during in 1984, during the presidential election, and Jesse Jackson was a candidate. Andrew Young, the former UN ambassador, might remember, they made some anti-Semitic comments which were widely publicized. And these remarks were thought to have extended that era of African American and Jewish distrust that continued into the 1980s. In 1991, and I can't believe that it is almost 30 years ago, a Black mob that had been involved in the Crown Heights riot killed an Orthodox Jew by the name of Yankel Rosenbaum after a car that was driven by a Jew hit and killed accidentally a Black boy in the neighborhood. And some commentators believe that this unrest was related to anti-Semitism. The two ethnic groups in that area of Crown Heights lived in very close proximity to each other in the neighborhood. The Orthodox Jewish community had been expanding. This Orthodox Jew who sadly killed this young Black boy with his car. It was accidental, but that stirred this anti-Semitic controversy. So there was a mob that killed an Orthodox Jew in retaliation. And during the 1990s, anti-Semitism became very widespread in Black communities on college campuses. There were new many more Black history classes, Black American history classes that were taught, and revealed more data about the Jewish slave trade. Some commentators claiming that Jews had dominated in this slave trade. There was a professor at the City College of New York by the name of Leonard Jeffries. He was a proponent of this idea, but his conclusions have also been disputed by many other African American historians of the slave trade. So there have been African American historians on both sides of the issue of Jews' involvement in the slave trade. And so we see that we have anti-Semitic sentiment that has been growing since the late 60s, since right before and certainly after the death of Martin Luther King. There was a survey in 1998 that showed that Blacks, 34%, were nearly 4 times as likely as whites, only 9%, to have answers that identified them as belonging in the most anti-Semitic category. So a survey that was done showed 34% versus 9% of whites as being in these anti-Semitic categories. Be curious to find out what that is today. Remember, this was a survey that was done, let's see, 23 years ago, 22 years ago. Among Blacks with no college education, 43% responded as the most anti-Semitic group versus 18% for the general population. The percentage fell from 43% to 27% among Blacks with some college education and 18% among Blacks with a 4-year college degree versus 5% for the general population. So it seems that education is one of the tools against anti-Semitism. And not surprisingly, right? I think that's one of those aha moments that's really like a duh moment. We should know better. The Nation of Islam, which we predominantly know as the purview of Louis Farrakhan, but before him, Elijah Muhammad, claimed that Blacks and not whites or Europeanized Jews are the chosen people. And Louis Farrakhan has also claimed that African Americans are the chosen people. He's given many speeches, and he's been out there again in more recent months, spouting anti-Semitic rhetoric again, declaring to the world that Europeans and Jews are not the chosen people, that the Black people of America and the Western Hemisphere are the chosen people, and so on. So there's been a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism among Blacks from the Nation of Islam. I'm not going to go into all the details of that. But let's talk for a minute about racism among Jews, because there has been plenty of it. And as somebody born in the mid-50s who lived through the 60s and the civil rights movement of the 60s and the Vietnam War and so on and so forth, I can tell you that there is a counterpart to to racism, and that is Jewish anti-Black racism. And, dating back for a long time, some Black customers and tenants felt that Jewish shopkeepers and landlords treated them unfairly and were racist. James Baldwin has made comments about Jewish shopkeepers in Harlem. This is going back some time. But even in more recent essays, Blacks and Jews, the Uncivil War, asserted that Jews had been perpetrators of racial hate. He noted that 3,000 members of the African Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem, founded in 1966 in Chicago, were denied citizenship as Jews when they moved en masse to Israel. The Americans claimed that they had the right of citizenship as Jews under the Israeli law of return, Under the law, the only people recognized as Jews are people who are born Jews, having a Jewish mother or maternal grandmother, and those with Jewish ancestry having a Jewish father or grandfather, and people who convert. Um, so, um, and how do we justify the enormous influx, rightly so, of Jews from Ethiopia um, who were airlifted by the Israelis to Israel and are part of, I'm not even going to say they're part of Israeli society, they are Israelis now into their third and fourth generations already, serving in the army, working side by side with white Jews in Israel. That isn't to say that there is not racial tension in Israel. There are racial problems in Israel, but that's a whole different subject. So, we have continued to see um, uh, racial discrimination by Jews in the United States for generations. And I think for those of you who grew up or came of age or were young adults or even older adults in the 50s and 60s, it was not uncommon for you to possibly belong to a Jewish country club where all of the staff was African American. I've been to some of these clubs and was and I'm not talking about decades ago. I'm talking about maybe 2 decades ago, where African Americans are still predominantly the wait staff, the house cleaning staff, and so on of these clubs, and you could see the racial disparity, and it is disturbing. It's very disturbing, and so the great question is, how can we be allies to our African American friends and citizens, co-citizens in the United States? And I think that this issue has really come to the fore and come to light so much more powerfully over the past couple of weeks, with the critical event being this murder of George Floyd almost 2 weeks ago now, and people of all colors, of all nationalities, of all ethnicities, of all religions, of all ages coming to protest what we have been witnessing for years now, which is a discrimination in the way in which justice is meted out on people of color versus white people in the United States. The incarceration of people of color to a much, much higher degree for much less severe crimes. And certainly the issues of gerrymandering, of discrimination of African Americans at polls and things of that nature. So these are all issues that you can read about on your own, that you can decide on what side of the issue you come down. I'm going to recommend to you one book to read. I'm going to recommend to you one website to go to, and then I'm going to read a couple statements from some of our Jewish movements, not just the Reform movement, conservative movement, as well as from some Orthodox rabbis. So we're going to do that right now. Okay, so first the book. And you'll have to excuse me while I'm looking down at my notes because I want to make sure that I get the information to you correctly. The book is called White Fragility. White Fragility. why it's so hard for white people to talk about racism. This is the book that is being touted as the one to read. If you are a white person who is in any way interested in learning about racism, how to be an ally, and so on. And I'm going to read you briefly a description of the book. The New York Times best-selling book exploring the counterproductive reactions white people have when their assumptions about race are challenged, and how these reactions maintain racial inequality. In this vital, necessary, and beautiful book, anti-racist educator Robin DiAngelo deftly illuminates the phenomenon of white fragility and allows us to understand racism as a practice not restricted to bad people. Referring to the defensive moves that white people make when challenged racially, white fragility is characterized by emotions such as anger, fear, and guilt, and by behaviors including argumentation and silence. These behaviors, in turn, function to reinstate white racial equilibrium and prevent any meaningful cross-racial dialogue. In this in-depth exploration, DiAngelo examines how white fragility develops, how it protects racial inequality, and what we can do to engage more constructively. The book, again, called White Fragility. I'm going to give you the name of the author. The author's name is Robin, R-O-B-I-N, DiAngelo, D-I-A-N-G-E-L-E-O. Now, I ordered the book yesterday. It is sold out in paperback on Amazon. I don't know yet when it's going to be available, so if I don't get it within the next day or so, I will probably order it on my Kindle. Although this is the kind of book I really like to have a physical copy of, because I like to take notes and highlight and so on and so forth. But I will most likely order it on my Kindle unless I get the hard copy pretty quickly. The book costs $12.24 on Prime, and it is about the same on Kindle. So that's what I can tell you. I have not read it yet. I'm hearing amazing things about it, and I hope that some of you will decide to read it as well. Secondly, I want to direct you to a website, and the website is RAC, like Robert Allen Charlie, RAC.org. And that stands for Religious Action Center. The Religious Action Center is the social action arm of the Reform Jewish movement. Now, I'm giving you a caveat here. What you're going to find there is mostly very progressive opinions on social issues. Everything from abortion to capital punishment to Medicaid to voting rights, you name it. But I want to read to you from the statement that came out a couple of days ago from the Religious Action Center, which, as I mentioned, is the social justice arm of the Reform movement. This is what they said. URJ statement witnessing protest rage and our Torah's unbending demand for justice. Our country simply cannot achieve the values of justice for all to which it aspires until we address ongoing racism in all sectors and at all levels of society. Rabbi Jonah Dov Pesner, director of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism and senior vice president of the Union for Reform Judaism, issued the following statement. On Shavuot, as we recited the Torah anew, as we received the Torah anew, with its unbending demand for justice, we also witnessed protests in Minneapolis, Louisville, and around the United States, allowing the all-too-familiar lethargy in bringing George Floyd's killers to justice. This was written, by the way, on the 30th of May, and today is June 7th, so this is just a week ago. And how things have changed, because George Floyd's killers have been charged, and we'll see where that goes. The national rage expressed at the murder of Mr. Floyd reflects the depth of pain over the injustice that people of color, and particularly Black men, have been subjected to throughout the generations. In recent months, we have seen yet again too many devastating examples of persistent systemic racism leading to the deaths not only of Mr. Floyd, but of other precious souls, including Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery. We remember others before them: Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin, Sandra Bland, Oscar Grant, Philando Castile, Walter Scott, Terrence Crutcher, Samuel DuBose, Michael Brown. The list feels endless, and so too is our despair. But as we recite the mourner's Kaddish for them all, we say now again, we will not sit idly by. Lo tachmod al dam re'echa, do not sit idly by the blood of your neighbor. Our country cannot achieve the values of justice for all to which it aspires until we address ongoing racism in all sectors and at all levels of society. We remain in solidarity and action with the NAACP's urgent #WeAreDoneDying campaign, whose policy demands cover areas of criminal justice, economic justice, healthcare, and voting, especially as the COVID-19 pandemic continues to disproportionately impact Black Americans. As the NAACP says, senseless hate crimes and incidents of COVID-19 cases and deaths spreading through the Black community display the continuance of systemic racism and privilege granted to white people in America. We pray for the families of Mr. Floyd, Ms. Taylor, Mr. Arbery, and all those whose lives have been so cruelly and violently taken, and we renew our commitment to working to achieve a nation that exemplifies compassion and justice for all. So this was the statement that came out of the Union for Reform Judaism through the Religious Action Center, and I urge you to go to urj.org and rac.org so that you can read other statements on other topics of social justice and see where you fall on the continuum. Now I want to read to you the statement that came out on Sunday, May 31st from the conservative Masorti rabbis. This is Masorti meaning traditional rabbis, not Orthodox traditional, but conservative, in response to the murder of George Floyd, saying a pattern of racism, police brutality against Black Americans. And this is their statement. In 2016, in response to incidents of police brutality against Black people in Ferguson, Missouri, Baltimore, and other cities in the United States, the Rabbinical Assembly, the International Association for Conservative Rabbis, passed a resolution on racial injustice and police brutality, which called on lawmakers to pass legislation aimed at reducing decades of historically high levels of inequality, especially in our prison system. It also called on members across the country to form deep, meaningful relationships with local communities across lines of faith and race in order to better understand the issues that impact us all and to be in solidarity with movements for social justice and inequality. We are dismayed that since then insufficient progress has been made, and as we bear witness today to the brutality of treatment and subsequent death of George Floyd by law enforcement, We cannot remain silent. As the Torah teaches, we will not stand idly by while our neighbor's blood is shed. Leviticus 19:16. The scourge of racism is prevalent in only some, but far too much of our law enforcement, and must be addressed, and those guilty of abuse must be held accountable to the strictest penalty. It has become profoundly evident that the overwhelming majority of decent officers and others entrusted with police powers and their oversight have not been able to make the necessary changes to a system that disproportionately targets minorities and communities of people of color. We join in the collective call for peace and reflection during civil unrest, but understand that to achieve this end, we must act. For these reasons, the Rabbinical Assembly calls on legislators at the national, state, and local levels to fundamentally change their approach to law enforcement and the justice system so that they serve and protect all Americans, regardless of race or ethnicity. We encourage our members to reach out to other communities, to Jews of color, as well as to local law enforcement, to help lead and shape these endeavors within the community. So that was the statement of the conservative movement. And I also want to briefly read to you about the 130 Jewish groups, 130 Jewish organizations outraged by the George Floyd killing. This is an article that came out on June 3rd by the Jewish Telegraph Association, which is like the AP or the UPI, but for the Jewish world. Dozens of American Jewish groups have pledged to work to end systematic racism. In a statement Tuesday, 130 organizations said they were outraged by the killing of Floyd, a black man who died in police custody last week. His death and those of other African Americans at the hands of law enforcement have led to protests throughout the world. And I'm not going to read you the list of the 130 organizations. That is something that you can look up and see for yourselves. You can read their statement of solidarity and you can see who these groups were. But what they are saying is we pledge to join forces with the Black community and other Americans to see through these changes to law enforcement and to end systemic racism and work for a more just American society. And so the statement was issued by the Jewish Council for Public Affairs and signed by these 130 Jewish organizations. So I've tried in these past few sessions with you, both in Chai There with Rabbi Leah and today, to give us a brief synopsis of the roller coaster ride of Jewish-Black relations for 400 years. And those areas in which we've had great success and those areas in which we have had, in which growth is necessary and change is necessary. And I don't think there is a human being among us who could watch that murder of George Floyd and not want to cry out in rage at what has happened. He did not deserve to die in the way he died. And my hope is that we are going to see substantial and significant change in our system, in a system that has become so systemically entrenched in racism that it may take us a very long time to lift ourselves out of that trench. But that perhaps this is once again the beginning of American Jewish and American Black relations, which will see greater promise, greater cooperation, and justice for all. And I want to leave you with the words of the sage Hillel, who said, "If I am not for myself, who am I? If I am only for myself, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? But if I am only for myself, then what am I? And if not now, when?" Shabbat Shalom. Thank you for joining me. And if you have questions, comments, responses, I would love to see them. And in the interim, please email me or call me. And any of the citations that I have given you today, I am happy to give them to you again if you need to jot them down. Shabbat Shalom. Have a wonderful afternoon. Bye-bye.